just start sharing. So, hi, I'm Portia Muehlbauer, and my research project is entitled The Missing Piece, Rehumanization in Countering Violent Extremism Initiatives, and my advisor was the lovely Reiner Braun. This presentation is going to include information and research from my case study in the fall of 2020 that I did during my international research and internship semester, as well as information and research from my current thesis project that I'm doing in my capstone semester. So I wanted to start off with some terms and definitions because it can be quite technical at times. So to start off, violent extremism and terrorism and the difference. So they're separate phenomena, but the concepts are closely interlinked. Both of the concepts are context specific and often lack clear definitions. But in this presentation, violent extremism refers to the beliefs and actions of people who support or use violence to achieve ideological or religious goals, while terrorism refers to the acts or the threat of violence with the purpose to intimidate or cause fear amongst the general public, compel a state or international organization to do or refrain from any act, or to destabilize a religious, political, economic, or social institution. Continuing on, preventing countering violent extremism, or the acronym PCVE that I might use frequently, is similar to counterterrorism in the fact that it's preventing and countering that extremism aspect that I just spoke about. And then radicalization is the process of acquiring a system of ideas and ideals that glorify hostility, discrimination, fanaticism, hatred, and enmity against a group or groups on the basis of their identity. And then to take a step further, radicalization leading to violent extremism, or RLVE, is radicalization that directly leads to an individual committing acts of violence. Basically, radicalization is an individual adopting an increasingly extremist set of beliefs and aspirations. And then I also want to note that that process isn't exactly linear. It's frequently nonlinear. And then finally, de-radicalization, disengagement, rehabilitation, reintegration, or DDRR, is the process of reforming, for lack of a better word at the moment, an individual who was previously or currently radicalized, disengaging them in the violence that they're participating in, rehabilitating them, and then reintegrating them back into society. And so what did I research? So this is what I researched in my case study, and I was looking at the use of human rights centric and gender sensitive approaches to counter extremism and whether they can be more effective than those traditional hard security and heavily militaristic state sponsored approaches at preventing extremism, as well as addressing the drivers of violent extremism. And then what I'm currently researching is how rehumanization can be prioritized in countering violent extremism initiatives through de-radicalization, disengagement, rehabilitation, and reintegration, or DDRR, and the effect that has on the efficacy of PCV efforts. So why is this significant? Current approaches to counterterrorism and counter-extremism are violent and inherently antithetical to the promotion of human rights, and those traditional approaches are heavily military-driven and include practices such as torture. And then when CVE initiatives are executed through civil society, there's a greater ability to address the socioeconomic and cultural drivers of radicalization. As well as when soft security approaches are used, there's less potential for radicalization in response to those initiatives. What methods did I employ, and how did I go about researching this topic? So I had 2 internships, and I'm currently interning in one of them. Last semester, I was an intern at Without Borders, a leading counter-extremism NGO based in Vienna, Austria, that predominantly uses gender-sensitive base approach in the fall of 2020. And then I'm currently an intern at Hidayah this semester in spring of 2021. Hidayah is regarded as the leader in the field of CV because of the body of research and publications that they produce in addition to the initiatives that they implement around the world, predominantly in Northwest Africa and Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And I also had the opportunity to have a semi-structured interview with Edith Schaffer, the executive director and founder of Without Borders, that is also regarded as an expert on the role of women and gender in violent extremism, and some limitations I encountered. So Without Borders and Hadai actually require interns to sign non-disclosure agreements. So I'm unable to use information from the organization or my time at these organizations that's not publicly available. Some of the key themes that I recognize in the literature surrounding my research topic are gender and violent extremism, degrees of volunteerism in violence, and violence and recidivism, community resilience, as well as family and friends in the disengagement process. For the sake of time, I won't be touching more on the literature here specifically, but I'll be discussing them in the upcoming slides. Feel free to reach out after the presentation if you're interested in learning more about the literature surrounding my research. And so first, I want to go over radicalization a bit because it's really important to understanding my research. And so in the literature, as well as in practice, there are two widely accepted types of drivers of violent extremism, push and pull factors. And so push factors are the conditions that are conducive to violent extremism at a structural level. So political, socioeconomic, or cultural. And then, sorry, my computer's dying. Macro push factors refer to the structural conditions that may make an environment more conducive to radicalization and increase an individual's personal grievances. So these can be unemployment, lack of access to education, and ethnic marginalization, to name a few. On the individual level, push factors are called individual vulnerabilities, and that refers to the personal or environmental circumstances that make that individual more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors or to be drawn to particular violent extremist narratives. So these are frustration from lack of employment, lack of personal identity, and potentially a detachment from country or family identity. On the other side, there are pull factors. And so those are the existing narratives that may pull individuals to join an extremist group. And so macro pull factors are the existence of narratives or ideals that can be distorted by extremist recruiters, and they might resonate well to a specific community, and they're able to attract vulnerable individuals. So these can be the ideals distorted, such as the caliphate or socioeconomic inequality and how that affects individuals. And then that individual level of pull factors, it's referred to as individual incentives, and they're personal, material, or social elements. And so this is a lot of what my research was looking at, that a vulnerable individual wants to acquire and that may drive him or her to join violent extremist groups. So this can be a sense of acquired identity in a violent extremist group, as well as economic incentives and a sense of adventure. So there's this 3N model of radicalization and recruitment: needs, narratives, and networks. And so needs are those push factors and recruiters exploiting those push factors that we just talked about, and drivers specifically through the activation of a significance quest. And so significance quest theory is basically that if needs are not met, people seek significance elsewhere. And so this quest can be activated through a loss of significance, meaning humiliation or deprivation, threat to loss of significance, so avoiding negative future consequences or ostracization, and opportunity for significance gain, so those incentives and opportunity to gain material things. And recruiters can activate an individual's quest for significance throughout the recruitment process, and that's their aim. And so the second level would be narratives. And so that's the leveraging of those pull factors. It's exploiting the needs and drawing attention to frustrations that individuals may have through the narratives and through telling a different story of their organization and highlighting how their group fulfills the needs of the individual they're recruiting. Then the final N is networks. And so that's how recruiters rely on communities and networks of people to recruit. And so this can be online or in person. And a huge part of recruitment is developing a relationship between the recruiter and the individual being recruited. And that goes into that third N. So I also want to talk a little bit about responses to radicalization. And this goes directly into initiatives and programs that organizations in the field of CV, countering violent extremism, are actively implementing. So the first is counter-radicalization. These are efforts to delegitimize violent extremist ideologies and to deter recruitment into specific extremist groups or campaigns. So the 3 Ds of counter-radicalization are deter, delegitimize, and divert. These are your preventative measures. So these are programs that are implemented in schools with children before they might have the experience to interact with an individual in an extremist group. So this is your prevention, the P and the PCVE. Then you have de-radicalization. And so those are concerted efforts directed at radicalized individuals themselves and in any stage of the extremist lifestyle. So this can be immediately before joining a group, it can be while they're active members or following their exit. And so these efforts seek to stop involvement in violence or to change the attitudes and assumptions of those who are currently participating in these extremist organizations. So what did I find in my research? First and foremost, and this is mostly from my case study, but it's continued, that civil society has huge potential as an agent of positive social change. When you can change the perception of the general public of a specific group or violent extremists themselves, you can shift entire narratives, and that's truly powerful. And there are CVE organizations working towards this at the moment, and it opens up so many doors in starting the necessary conversations to build community resilience that I touched on earlier against the recruitment of individuals into violent extremist groups. And then I'd also like to touch on the degrees of volunteerism, because it's quite a significant piece in understanding my research surrounding the DDRR principles. And so literature on de-radicalization, disengagement, rehabilitation, reintegration distinguishes between voluntary and involuntary membership in extremist groups, and the process and needs of reintegrating and rehabilitating returnees will be different depending on whether recruitment was voluntary or involuntary. And so someone recruited forcibly may need more psychological support or support relating to their physical safety than the changing of extremist behaviors when you're going through that DDRR process. And then the individuals who are forcibly recruited are also less likely to radicalize others, which is an important aspect to when you're in practice. And so one aspect to this is gender. The degree of volunteerism in engaging with violent extremist organizations, specifically in conflict-affected states, may differ between men and women. And there was actually a survey done of 63 female and 56 male former members of Boko Haram in Northwest Africa. And it found that 17% of the women versus 5% of the men had been recruited by force. And then also through that study, we also look at economic inequality, and it's a slightly more telling aspect surrounding volunteerism. And so the study above surveyed 119 members total. Motivating factor. So this plays into the degrees. So that's 21% total who the primary cause of recruitment was due to a form of economic incentive, which is a fifth of when you're extrapolating. So then this plays into those degrees that I'm talking about. And so Lena Grip and Janina Kotajoki, which are two scholars at the forefront of this, argue that there are varying degrees of voluntary membership. And so while abduction is a clear-cut involuntary membership, they do consider engagement motivated by poverty or severe poverty as not fully voluntary. And I thought that was really interesting. And then it also shows how that DDR process and rehabilitation and reintegration can be really effective for those who are involuntary recruited. So, what does this all mean? Countering violent extremism programs have the potential to be more effective than those traditional violent approaches But programs that lack a focus on the rehumanization of the other, and in this case, stigmatized religious group, political group, or the extremists themselves, may be structuring their programming around a flawed mission, which could make their work less effective or lead to radicalization in reverse for either their program participants or a member of the public observing their work. And so while I didn't talk about the programs as much specifically, not just through the DDRR program and rehabilitation programs, there's also a lot of those preventative programs looking at parental education and shifting narratives of families and home life, as well as community life surrounding how to kind of combat those vulnerabilities that we talked about. And a lot of it plays into societal programs as well, and welfare as being a really big preventative measure against joining violent extremist groups, not on that involuntary and economic inequality side, not so much on combating the actual ideologies. And then also there can be a great deal of profiling in the field. And I believe that CV programs should be integrated more broadly into society and turn away from focusing on at-risk communities for that reason above. Although I do acknowledge that targeted approaches can be very effective when executed well. And some areas for further research. So I'd like to follow along as de-radicalization, disengagement, rehabilitation, reintegration for those at a point in the radicalization process becomes more respected in the field and more studied, because I think there's a lot of potential for it. And then also the counter-extremism cycle. Some experts say that there's a distinct cycle to counter-extremism efforts themselves within the general public and how they play off of extremist groups and radicalized individuals. And I think that, and when taken into account, it can improve the efficacy of programming. And I believe there's a lot of potential for the improvement of CV programs and initiatives through that. Thank you so much. Thanks for bearing with me through technical difficulties as well. If you have any further questions, there's my email, and I'll also pop it into the Zoom chat for you all. If you have any questions.
Thank you. Yes, so applause for Portia. I see a couple of hands right away, and I also have one too. So I think I saw Paul's hand go up first.
I just wanted to know how you came about the topic and why are you interested in it?
Yeah, so I had previously, during my time at LIE Global, been looking at violence against women and specifically forced marriage, as well as bride kidnapping in Central Asia. And I came to Women Without Borders from that violence against women standpoint and wanting to look more into that topic and explore kind of some different aspects than just forced marriage. And a huge part of their mission and their programming is that preventing and countering violent extremism. And I was able to work really closely on their Mother Schools program. I didn't get a chance to talk about as much that is that parental education aspect of how can we teach mothers as well as fathers. They have a Father Schools program in addition about violent extremism so they can help create resilient children. And after that, I became a lot more interested in violent extremism as a whole. And then taking it a step further, when I started my internship at Hidayah, they have trainings in Tunisia. I was able to experience the trainings that they had in Tunisia and Nigeria surrounding that rehabilitation and reintegration aspect. And they were training individuals who are social workers and teachers, as well as experts that work in the prison reform sector of society. And that's what led me to being really interested in that rehabilitation and reintegration aspect of taking it one step further from preventing, but how to actively counter that in a very different way than those traditional like counterterrorism, like kind of torture in Guantanamo Bay aspects that we have like in the US and that we see in the US a lot.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. Sumka, you have a question here from our Australia Asia Pacific Director.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks, Portia. Really great presentation. I understand that your engagement with the literature and then was sort of about violent extremism in general. And then it seems both of your internships were focused primarily at Islamic extremism. I'm wondering, since right-wing extremism is the fastest growing domestic terror threat in places like the United States and Australia, I'm wondering which of these insights you feel might carry over into countering right-wing extremism, and whether the body of literature is as extensive as it is in the field that you've been working in. I guess I'm thinking about, is that the same sort of gender dynamic? Would have focused on mothers also work in countering right-wing extremism? Are there other strategies that are needed beyond getting that woman I saw on TV, Skylar Silvera, onto it and solving it? Just wondering how that might apply across other forms of violent extremism, particularly right-wing extremism.
Yeah, so especially at my time at Women Without Borders, I got to see specifically how you have to take different approaches to right-wing extremism versus Islamic extremism. And so that mother and women specific aspect looks very different from a right-wing approach. There's not as much literature specifically surrounding it, and that also plays into like state interests. And so there's a lot of state interests surrounding Islamic extremism versus right-wing extremism at the moment in both the US as well as Central Europe. And so when you look at women in right-wing extremist groups, a lot of the discourse is surrounding it's not that like involuntary participation, it's that their ideological convictions are much more in line with the men and with their husbands. And so you can't prevent it so much, because a lot of the preventative and mother school programs is kind of separating women into their own section, getting them separate, and then kind of using them as like that first line of creating like a counter narrative. And that's a lot more difficult to do with women involved in right-wing extremism. And so it takes place more in that DDRR approach, in that intercepting kind of that radicalization process and reforming kind of those ideologies. And it's a much more difficult process. And it's been kind of ignored by the field. And I hope as the threat rises, that it's focused on more. I'm not as confident in that within the US. I had the opportunity to take a course at Long Island University at the Post campus, and we had a few speakers who were experts in counterterrorism in the US, and a lot of experts in the US look at violent extremism and like right-wing and domestic terrorism as inherently kind of non-existent through like freedom of speech. And so say that like hate crimes and domestic terrorism, since US citizens have that freedom of speech, that it's just a crime and that you can't attach kind of their ideologies to it, which is a really interesting dichotomy that I hadn't experienced or like even looked at before. And so I really hope that as like the future generation of leaders, like my generation, that's much more interested in that countering violent extremism approach and that counterterrorism approach, and soft security versus hard security kind of become more predominant in the literature and in practice, that will kind of shift the narrative surrounding CVE and counterterrorism as a whole.
Wonderful. Thanks. Wonderful. I believe you addressed my question too in your wonderful comprehensive answer. One question which may be hard for you to answer because of your non-disclosure agreements, but you did in addition to doing that very rigorous bibliographic research, you also conducted qualitative research as a participant observer and as a very hardworking intern in these two very important organizations, as you pointed out. So I'm just really curious about the interplay and the insights, not the actual insights, but the level of insight you were able to glean from your participation. If you could talk a little bit about that almost full-bodied process of conducting research and the benefits of that, I'd be very interested.
Yeah, so my experiences in my internships were what drove me to my research topics in the first place, and they're really integral in my process. And it was really my experiences and being able to be a part of the process of the programs and initiatives that both organizations were actively kind of participating in at the time aided my bibliographic research. It told me exactly what I needed to look for. And I went off of a lot of the publications and the research that was already done by both of the organizations and kind of took my own approach in forming my own opinions surrounding, like, through the use of literature. And so while I couldn't talk specifically on a lot of the knowledge that I acquired as an intern, it played directly in every step of the way in informing what I was researching through the literature, if that answers your question.
It did wonderfully. Thank you ever so much, Portia. Portia.